The clock on the hospital cafeteria wall read 12:47 a.m., its second hand clicking through the silence like a heartbeat that refused to rest. Outside, rain poured from black skies, turning the empty parking lot into a mirror of fractured light and shadow. Helen Riggs stood behind the counter, her white uniform wrinkled and stained from a double shift that had pushed her past exhaustion into something rawer. Fear. Her hands shook slightly as she stacked clean mugs, her dark eyes constantly flickering toward the glass doors, because beyond those doors, through the sheets of rain, she could see him. Again. Helen had worked at Mercy General Hospital for 3 years, pouring herself into 12-hour shifts in the trauma ward, holding hands with dying patients, calming frightened families, being the steady presence when everything else fell apart. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where strength wasn't optional, where her grandmother taught her that a black woman in this world had to be twice as good to get half as far. And Helen had been. She'd earned her nursing degree while working nights at a convenience store, saved every dollar, never complained. But all that strength couldn't protect her from Patrick Lang. 6 weeks ago, he'd been just another patient. Car accident victim, polite enough, quiet. She'd treated his broken ribs, monitored his recovery, done her job with the same compassion she showed everyone. But after his discharge, the messages started. Flowers at the nurse's station with no name attached. Notes tucked under her windshield wipers. "Your smile saved me. I need to see you." Then the following. His car idling outside her apartment. His shadow at the edge of the hospital parking lot. His presence like smoke that wouldn't clear. She'd reported it, filed complaints, begged security to help. But the responses were always the same. "He hasn't done anything illegal. We can't act on a feeling." So the fear became her companion, constant, exhausting, inescapable. If you believe that heroes don't always announce themselves, that protection can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest hearts, then I need you to hear this story. Before we begin, take a moment to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that good still exists in this world. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Because tonight's story is about the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines, the kind that simply stands between darkness and light and refuses to move. Now, let's get into the story. Tonight, through the rain-blurred glass, Patrick stood beneath a dying streetlight, his eyes fixed on her. Watching. Always watching. Helen's breath caught in her throat, and her hands gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. She'd read somewhere that fear lives in the not knowing, in the waiting for something terrible to finally happen. Then she noticed the other man. He sat at the far end of the counter, broad-shouldered and silent, wrapped in a faded red hoodie that looked like it had seen 1,000 storms. His hands, scarred, powerful, rested beside an untouched cup of coffee. His presence was heavy, almost oppressive. The kind that made people instinctively keep their distance. She'd seen him before, heard the whispers. Jack Gibson, former firefighter, lost his whole crew in a warehouse fire, now living like a ghost on the edges of life. Some said he was dangerous, others said he was broken. But in that moment, Helen didn't care about rumors. She cared that he looked like someone who wouldn't run. Her feet carried her toward him, and before she could second-guess herself, she leaned close and whispered, her voice cracking with desperation, "He keeps following me." Jack's eyes lifted, dark pools that held depths of pain she couldn't fathom. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, really saw her, in a way that made her feel less alone. Then his gaze shifted to the windows, to the shadow of Patrick standing in the rain. His jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unshakable, each word a promise carved in stone. Stay here. Don't look back. Minutes later, the automatic doors hissed open, and the rain invited itself inside. But before that moment, before Jack Gibson stood between her and the darkness, Helen's nightmare had been building for weeks. It started small, the way most horrors do, with kindness that curdled into obsession. 6 weeks earlier, Helen had been working a double shift in the trauma ward when they brought Patrick Lang in on a stretcher. Motorcycle accident. T-boned by a pickup truck that ran a red light. Broken collarbone. Fractured ribs. Road rash that looked like someone had taken sandpaper to his left side. He was conscious, crying from pain and shock, asking if he was going to die. Helen had held his hand while the doctors stabilized him. "You're going to be fine," she'd said, her voice steady, professional. "Just breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth." She'd done this 100 times, calming terrified patients, being the anchor in their storm. It was her job, her calling. Patrick had looked up at her with tears streaming down his face and whispered, "You're an angel." She'd smiled gently, squeezed his hand, and moved on to the next patient. Standard procedure. Compassion without attachment. She'd learned that boundary in nursing school, but Patrick Lang hadn't learned boundaries at all. He was in the hospital for 4 days. Every time Helen passed his room, he was watching the door, waiting for her. He'd light up when she checked his vitals, try to make conversation. Ask her personal questions she deflected with practiced ease. Where did she grow up? Did she have family? Was she seeing anyone? She kept her answers vague, professional, kind, but distant. On his discharge day, he'd thanked her profusely, told her she'd changed his life, that he'd never forget her. "Just doing my job," Helen had said, already moving toward her next patient. She should have seen it then, the way his eyes lingered too long, the desperation in his gratitude. But Helen had been raised to be kind, to assume the best in people. And she was tired. So tired. The flowers came first. A week after his discharge, a bouquet of red roses appeared at the nurse's station with a card that read, "To the angel who saved me. P." Helen's stomach had tightened, but she'd told herself it was just a thank you gesture. People sent flowers to hospitals all the time. She threw the card away and shared the roses with the other nurses. Then came the notes. Tucked under her windshield wiper in the hospital parking lot. "I think about you constantly. You make me feel alive again." Another one, days later. "I see you leaving work at 7:15 p.m. You look tired. I wish I could take care of you." That one made her hands shake as she unlocked her car, glancing around the parking lot. She didn't see him, but she felt watched. The sensation crawled over her skin like invisible insects. She'd gone to hospital security the next morning, showed them the notes. The guard, a heavy-set man named Carl who'd worked there for 20 years, had barely glanced at them. "It's probably just a grateful patient," he'd said, handing the notes back, "and some people don't know how to express appreciation appropriately. He'll move on." "He knows my schedule," Helen had insisted. "He's watching me." Carl had leaned back in his chair, sighing like she was being dramatic. "Has he threatened you, touched you, approached you directly?" "No, but then there's nothing we can do. File a report if it makes you feel better, but unless he does something actionable, Carl had shrugged. "He's harmless, Helen. Trust me. I've seen real stalkers. This guy's just lonely." Helen had walked away with rage burning in her chest. Harmless. That word would haunt her. 2 weeks later, Patrick showed up outside her apartment. It was 3 a.m. when the rumble of a motorcycle engine woke her from restless sleep. Helen lived in a small studio above a closed garage in a quiet neighborhood. Cheap rent, thin walls, a single window that faced the street. She'd been dreaming about her grandmother, about Sunday dinners and laughter, when the sound cut through the memory like a blade. She'd gotten up, moved to the window, and looked down through the gap in the curtains. There he was. Patrick Lang sat on his motorcycle directly across the street, his face illuminated by the amber glow of a streetlight. He wasn't looking away. He wasn't pretending to be passing by. He was staring directly up at her window, his hands resting on the handlebars, engine idling like a mechanical heartbeat. Helen had stepped back, her breath catching, heart slamming against her ribs. She'd grabbed her phone, pulled up 911, finger hovering over the call button. But what would she say? "There's a man sitting on his motorcycle outside my building?" Carl's voice echoed in her head. "Has he threatened you? Approached you directly?" She'd stood there in the darkness, phone clutched in trembling hands, waiting, watching. After 15 minutes, Patrick had revved his engine once, a deliberate, knowing sound, and driven away. Helen hadn't slept the rest of that night. After that, fear became routine. She learned his patterns the way you learn the rhythm of your own breathing. The hum of his motorcycle engine approaching her building around 2 or 3 a.m., always parking across the street, always watching. The faint knock on her apartment door, 3 soft taps, followed by silence. When she'd press her eye to the peephole, she'd see nothing but the empty hallway. But she'd hear his footsteps retreating down the stairs. She started calling her friend Shanice when the knocks came, putting the phone on speaker, pretending to have loud conversations. "Yeah, girl, my cousin's here visiting. Big guy, used to play football. He's staying the week." Lies designed to make Patrick think she wasn't alone. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes he left faster. But he always came back. Helen stopped sleeping properly. Dark circles formed under her eyes. She startled at every sound. Her co-workers noticed, "You okay, Helen? You look exhausted." But she smiled and said she was fine. Because what else could she say? That the system designed to protect her had failed? That harmless men were the most dangerous because no one believed you until it was too late? She'd filed 2 more reports with hospital security. Both went nowhere. She'd considered moving, but breaking her lease would cost money she didn't have. She'd thought about getting a restraining order, but her research told her it was just a piece of paper. And sometimes it made things worse. So she lived with it. The dread, the hypervigilance, the exhaustion of being afraid. Until tonight. Tonight, when Patrick's shadow appeared in the cafeteria windows, Helen had made a choice. She'd stopped waiting for someone to save her and whispered to the only person who looked like he might understand what it meant to stand against darkness. The man in the red hoodie. Now, as the automatic doors hissed open and Patrick Lang stepped inside, rain-soaked, eyes wild, her name on his lips like a curse, Helen stood frozen behind Jack Gibson's massive frame. Her heart pounding so hard, she thought it might break through her chest. And for the first time in weeks, she wasn't running. She was letting someone else stand between her and the shadow that wouldn't leave. Helen had first noticed the man in the red hoodie 3 weeks ago. It was a Thursday night, or technically Friday morning, since her shift had bled past midnight into that gray territory where time loses meaning and exhaustion becomes a second skin. She'd stumbled into the cafeteria for her break, desperate for coffee strong enough to keep her upright for another 4 hours, and there he was, sitting alone at the far end of the counter, massive shoulders hunched over a cup of black coffee, red hoodie pulled up despite the fluorescent warmth of the room, hands wrapped around the mug like he was trying to absorb its heat into his bones. He hadn't looked up when she entered, hadn't acknowledged her presence at all. Just sat there with an absolute stillness that felt almost unnatural, the kind of stillness that predators have, or men who've learned that movement draws attention they don't want. Helen had gotten her coffee and left quickly, but something about him had stayed with her, a sense of recognition she couldn't quite name. After that, she saw him constantly, always during night shifts, always alone, always in that same red hoodie that looked like it had weathered 1,000 storms. He'd sit at the counter nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, never eating, never scrolling through a phone, never reading, just existing in that heavy silence. The other nurses talked about him in hushed voices during shift changes. "That's Jack Gibson," Shanice had whispered one morning in the locker room, applying lipstick in the mirror. "Used to be a firefighter. Lost his whole crew in some warehouse fire a couple years back. He was the only one who made it out." "Jesus," someone else had murmured. "Yeah, word is he quit the force, dropped off the map. Then he started showing up at underground fight clubs in South Memphis. Bare-knuckle stuff, real brutal. Someone said he fights like a man who wants to die but can't figure out how." Helen had felt something twist in her chest at that, a recognition of pain she understood too well. "Why's he always here?" she'd asked. Shanice had shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe he volunteers or something. But girl, stay away from that one. I've seen those hands. They're covered in scars. Whatever demons he's fighting, you don't want to get caught in the middle." But Helen hadn't stayed away. Not exactly. She'd just watched, noticed. The way he always sat with his back to the wall, eyes on the entrance. The way his scarred knuckles would tighten around his coffee mug whenever someone got too loud, too close. The way he'd close his eyes sometimes, just for a few seconds, like he was fighting off memories that wouldn't leave him alone. She recognized that battle. She was fighting one of her own. Tonight, the cafeteria was nearly empty. It was past midnight, the dinner rush long gone, just Helen wiping down the counter during her break, and Jack in his usual spot at the far end. The rain hammered against the windows with relentless fury, turning the parking lot beyond into a watercolor smear of shadow and amber light. Helen should have left 20 minutes ago. Her break was over. But the thought of walking out into that parking lot, of scanning the shadows for Patrick's motorcycle, of feeling her keys between her fingers like makeshift weapons, it made her stomach clench with dread. So she stayed, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, reorganizing coffee supplies that didn't need organizing, anything to delay the inevitable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling hands, saw unknown number on the screen, and felt ice flood her veins. She knew. Even before she opened it, she knew. "Still waiting for you, Helen." The words blurred as tears of frustration burned behind her eyes. How did he get her number? She'd changed it twice, filed reports, begged for help. And still, Patrick Lang found ways to reach her, to remind her that she was being watched, that she was never truly alone, that he was always there, waiting. Her breath came shorter, faster. The cafeteria walls seemed to close in, She gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself, trying not to let the panic swallow her whole. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the rain-streaked windows, Jack's profile. His head had turned slightly, not enough to look at her directly, but enough that she could tell his attention had shifted. His jaw was tight. His shoulders had tensed beneath that worn red hoodie. He'd sensed something. Her fear, maybe. Or just the change in the air that fear brings. Helen's eyes darted from her phone to the windows, scanning the parking lot beyond. And there, standing beneath the dying glow of a streetlight, rain streaming down his gaunt face, was Patrick. He was looking right at the cafeteria windows, right at her. His phone was still in his hand, illuminated, like he wanted her to know he'd just sent that message. Her hands started shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. "He's escalating," a voice in her head whispered. "This isn't going to stop. It's going to get worse. Tonight might be the night he finally—" "You okay?" The voice startled her so badly she gasped. Helen spun around to find Jack standing about 6 feet away, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. Up close, she could see the details she'd only glimpsed from a distance, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The way his hands, scarred knuckles, thick fingers, hung loose at his sides like he was ready for something but didn't know what. Helen's voice cracked. She cleared her throat, tried again. "I'm fine, just tired." Jack's gaze held hers for a long moment, then shifted to the windows, to Patrick's silhouette in the rain. When he looked back at her, something in his expression had changed. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. "You don't look fine," he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough around the edges like he didn't use it much. "You look scared." Helen's defenses rose instinctively, the armor she'd built over years of being a black woman in spaces that didn't always welcome her, of being told her fears were exaggerations, of learning to handle things on her own because no one else would. "I can handle it." "Didn't say you couldn't." Jack's eyes went back to the windows, to Patrick. "But you shouldn't have to." Something about those words, the simplicity of them, the quiet certainty, made Helen's carefully constructed walls crack. Her eyes burned with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "Security won't help. Police won't help. Everyone keeps telling me he's harmless." "He's not." 2 words, flat, final, like Jack knew something about harm that others didn't. Helen followed his gaze to the parking lot, to Patrick's shadow still standing there, watching. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't need to look at it to know it was him. "He used to be my patient," she heard herself saying, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I was just doing my job. But now he won't leave me alone. He knows where I live. He shows up at 3 in the morning. He sends messages. And everyone tells me I'm overreacting." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're not." Helen looked up at him. This silent stranger in a red hoodie who everyone warned her away from, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition. Like he knew exactly what it felt like to be afraid and have no one believe you. "He's out there right now," she whispered. "I can't go home. I can't stay here. I don't know what to do anymore." Jack's jaw tightened. His scarred hands flexed once, then relaxed. He was quiet for so long that Helen thought maybe she'd said too much, shared too much, with a stranger who had his own demons to fight. But then Jack Gibson did something unexpected. He pulled out the stool beside him at the counter and nodded toward it. "Sit," he said quietly. "You don't have to go out there yet." Helen hesitated, every instinct screaming warnings about accepting help from men she didn't know. But as she glanced back at Patrick's shadow in the rain, something inside her broke. She was so tired, so afraid, so desperately alone. She sat, and in the reflection of the rain-streaked windows, she watched Jack position himself between her and the glass doors. Between her and Patrick. His presence was a wall, silent, immovable, and somehow safer than any security guard who'd dismissed her fears. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt like she could breathe. They sat in silence for several minutes, the rain creating a steady percussion against the windows. Helen clutched her coffee mug with both hands, the ceramic warm against her palms, grounding her. Jack said nothing, just sat with that same immovable stillness, his presence somehow louder than words. Then the automatic doors hissed open. The sound cut through the cafeteria like a knife. Helen's entire body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to look. She could feel it, that familiar dread that had become her constant companion, the animal instinct that screamed danger before her conscious mind could catch up. But she looked anyway. Patrick Lang stood just inside the entrance, rain dripping from his jacket onto the linoleum floor. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his face gaunt and pale under the fluorescent lights. But it was his eyes that made Helen's stomach drop, wild, feverish, fixed on her with an intensity that felt like hands around her throat. He took a step forward. "Helen," he called out, his voice carrying across the empty cafeteria. Too loud, too familiar. "There you are." Helen's hands started shaking so badly she had to set down her mug before she dropped it. Her mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. She could run, but where? The back exit led to the service corridors, dark and labyrinthine, even more dangerous. She could call security, but Carl would take 20 minutes to waddle over here, if he came at all. She could scream, but the cafeteria was nearly empty, just her and Jack, and the night shift janitor somewhere in the back. She was trapped. Patrick took another step, water squelching under his shoes. "We need to talk. You've been avoiding me." "That's not fair, Helen. After everything we've been through together." "We haven't been through anything," Helen wanted to scream. "I was your nurse. That's all I ever was." But the words stuck in her throat. Fear had stolen her voice. She could feel Jack beside her, his body tensed like a coiled spring. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye and saw his jaw tighten, saw his scarred hands flatten against the counter. He was watching Patrick with the same focused intensity she'd seen in trauma surgeons before they made a critical incision. Calm on the surface, but ready. Patrick was getting closer. 10 feet away now. His eyes never left Helen's face. "I've been patient," he continued, his voice taking on a pleading edge that somehow made it worse. "I've given you space, but you keep ignoring me. You won't answer my calls, my messages. You changed your number, twice, like I'm some kind of monster." "I'm not a monster, Helen. His voice cracked. "I just need you to see me." "I see you," Helen thought. Panic rising like bile in her throat. "That's the problem. I see you everywhere. In my parking lot, outside my window, in every shadow and every sound. I can't stop seeing you." Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. Her vision started to narrow, tunnel vision creeping in from the edges. She was going to pass out. Or run. Or... No. Something inside Helen. Something forged in South Memphis, in her grandmother's kitchen, in every shift where she'd held dying patients and refused to let them see her fear. Hardened. She wasn't going to freeze. She wasn't going to be a victim. She stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced them to hold her weight. Patrick's eyes lit up when she moved, a terrible hope flooding his expression, like he thought she was finally coming to him. But Helen wasn't walking toward Patrick. She was walking toward Jack. Her feet carried her the few steps to where he sat, her breath shallow, her hands trembling violently. She could feel Patrick's eyes tracking her movement, could sense his confusion, but she didn't care. She leaned in close to Jack, close enough that she could smell rain and coffee, and something else. Wood smoke, maybe, or the metallic tang of old violence. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, cracking with fear and desperation. "He keeps following me." The words hung in the air between them, simple but weighted with weeks of terror, of sleepless nights, of unanswered pleas for help. Helen's eyes searched Jack's face, looking for something. Understanding, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that she wasn't crazy, that her fear was real and justified. Jack's eyes lifted slowly to meet hers, dark, steady, calm as deep water. There was no surprise in his expression, no shock or confusion, just awareness, like he'd been waiting for this moment, like some part of him had known it was coming. His gaze held hers for 3 heartbeats, and in that brief eternity, Helen saw something that made her breath catch for a different reason. She saw someone who understood what it meant to be hunted by things you couldn't escape. "Stay here," Jack murmured, his voice so low and steady it sounded like an oath, like a promise carved in stone. "Don't look back." Then he rose from his stool. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, but there was something about it that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Jack stood to his full height, easily 6'3", shoulders broad enough to block out the light, and the red hoodie that had looked worn and faded while he sat now gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights like a warning flare, like a line drawn in the sand. Helen took an instinctive step backward, suddenly aware of the coiled power in Jack's frame, the way his scarred hands hung loose at his sides with a fighter's readiness. This was the man people whispered about, the underground fighter. The one who'd survived when his crew didn't? The one who supposedly fought like a man with nothing left to lose. "Helen?" Patrick's voice had changed. The pleading edge was gone, replaced by confusion and the first hints of alarm. "Helen, who is this? What's going on?" Jack didn't answer. He simply turned, positioning himself between Helen and Patrick, his body a wall. His hood was up, casting his face in shadow, but his eyes, those dark, haunted eyes, were locked on Patrick with an intensity that could cut glass. The cafeteria fell silent, except for the rain drumming against the windows and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. Helen stood frozen behind Jack's massive frame, her hands pressed against her chest, feeling her heart trying to break through her ribs. She wanted to look away, wanted to close her eyes, but she couldn't. She was transfixed. Patrick had stopped moving. He stood in the middle of the cafeteria, water still dripping from his clothes, his expression shifting from confusion to something like fear. "Look, man, I don't know what she told you, but this is between me and her. This doesn't concern you." Jack said nothing. He just stood there, immovable as a mountain, his presence filling the space with a quiet menace that needed no words. "Seriously," Patrick tried again, his voice climbing an octave. "This is a private matter." Helen and I have a connection. We've been through something together. You don't understand. I understand. Jack's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried across the cafeteria with absolute authority. You need to leave. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a command, really. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how this was going to end. Patrick's face flushed red. Who the hell do you think you are? I'm not leaving. Helen, tell him. Tell him we need to talk. She doesn't want to talk to you. Jack's voice remained steady, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. And you're going to leave now. Like hell I am. Patrick took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. I've been waiting in the goddamn rain for hours. I'm not leaving until she talks to me, until she understands that we're meant to. Jack moved. It wasn't fast, wasn't aggressive. He simply took one step forward, and somehow that single movement changed everything. The air thickened. The temperature seemed to drop. Patrick's words died in his throat as Jack's shadow fell across him, as he suddenly realized what Helen had already sensed. That the man in the red hoodie wasn't just big, wasn't just strong. He was dangerous. Not in the way Patrick was dangerous, with his obsession and his violation of boundaries. Jack was dangerous in a different way, the way fire is dangerous, or storms, or any force of nature that doesn't need to make threats because its power is simply understood. Patrick took an involuntary step backward. Last chance, Jack said quietly. Walk out. Don't come back. Behind Jack's protective bulk, Helen finally remembered to breathe. Patrick's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, anger, defiance, and finally, the first real flicker of fear. But fear in men like Patrick didn't lead to wisdom. It led to desperation. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising, trying to reclaim some kind of authority. Helen, tell your friend here that this is between us. Tell him about the connection we have, about how you saved my life. I was doing my job, Helen heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere deeper than fear. That's all it was. My job. Patrick's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment, she saw something raw and ugly flash across his face. Your job? Is that what you call it? When you held my hand? When you told me I was going to be okay? When you looked at me like a patient, Helen interrupted, her voice shaking but growing stronger. Because that's what you were. That's all you were. The words landed like a slap. Patrick's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He took another step forward, his eyes wild. You don't mean that. You're just scared. You're confused. If we could just talk alone without... Jack's hand came up. Not violently, not threateningly. He simply raised his right hand and placed it flat against Patrick's chest. Firm, immovable, final. The gesture was almost gentle, but the meaning was absolute. Stop. Patrick looked down at the hand on his chest, then up at Jack's face. From where Helen stood, she could see both men in profile. Patrick, wiry and wild-eyed, trembling with rage and obsession. Jack, massive and still, his expression carved from stone. Don't, Jack said quietly. Just that one word. Don't. Get your hand off me. Patrick's voice cracked, trying to sound dangerous but coming out desperate. I'm warning you, man. You don't know who you're messing with. I've got rights. I can call the cops. I can... Call them. Jack's voice remained level, almost conversational. Tell them you've been stalking a woman for weeks, following her home, sending threatening messages. standing outside her apartment at 3 in the morning. Tell them all of it. Patrick's face went pale. It's not, I wasn't, that's not what this is. That's exactly what this is. Jack's hand didn't move from Patrick's chest. And it ends tonight. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped. The cook and the janitor must have sensed the tension and frozen, watching from wherever they stood. The only sound was the rain hammering against the windows and the harsh fluorescent hum of the lights overhead. Patrick tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. Too high, too thin, the sound of a man whose bravado was crumbling. Hey, man, you've got this all wrong. I'm not some kind of criminal. We just need to talk. Clear the air. That's all. Helen knows I'd never hurt her. Don't you, Helen? Helen said nothing. Her silence was its own answer. Patrick's eyes darted back to Jack. And something shifted in his expression. Maybe he saw what Helen had seen. That quiet, immovable certainty. That willingness to stand in the gap between darkness and light and simply refuse to move. Or maybe he saw something deeper. The scars on Jack's knuckles, the way he stood with a fighter's balance, the decades of pain and loss and survival written into every line of his body. Whatever Patrick saw, it finally broke through the delusion. Look, he said, his voice dropping to a whine. I don't want any trouble. I just want to talk to her. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. 5 minutes, and then I'll leave. I promise. No, Jack's response was immediate. Absolute. You're going to leave now. You're not going to come back. Not here. Not to her apartment. Not anywhere she is. You're going to delete her number. Delete her address. Delete everything, and you're going to stay gone. You can't tell me what to do. But even as Patrick said it, he was taking another step backward. You're nobody. You don't have any authority. Helen, tell him. Tell him we need to... Jack leaned forward slightly, and Patrick's words died mid-sentence. It wasn't an aggressive movement, just a subtle shift in weight. But the threat was unmistakable. Jack's voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before, which somehow made it more terrifying. You need to leave. 4 words, simple, final, delivered with the certainty of a man who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer and come out the other side with nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. Patrick stared up at Jack's shadowed face, and Helen watched something inside him break. His shoulders sagged, his hands unclenched. The wild desperation in his eyes gave way to something else, the hollow-eyed awareness of a man who'd finally met an immovable object and realized he wasn't the unstoppable force he'd imagined himself to be. This isn't over, Patrick said, but the words had no conviction behind them. I'll come back. When you're not around. When she's alone. No, you won't. Jack's hand remained on Patrick's chest, steady as stone. Because if you do, I'll be waiting. I'm here every night. Midnight to dawn, right there. He nodded toward his usual spot at the counter. And I notice things. I remember faces. So if you come back, if you so much as drive past this hospital, I'll know. And next time, we won't talk. It wasn't a threat. Threats implied uncertainty, the possibility of negotiation. This was a promise, a guarantee. Patrick's face crumpled. He tried one last time to salvage something, his pride, his obsession, his twisted narrative. Helen, please, I love you. Don't you understand? Everything I've done, it's because... "It's because you're sick," Helen said, her voice cutting through his confession like a scalpel. "And I'm not your salvation. I'm not your second chance. I'm just a woman who wants to do her job and go home without being terrified. That's it. That's all I ever was." The truth of it, the brutal, simple truth, seemed to hit Patrick harder than any physical blow could have. His eyes filled with tears, but Helen felt no sympathy. Only exhaustion, relief, and a fierce, burning satisfaction that finally, someone was standing between her and this nightmare. Patrick took another step back, then another. Jack's hand fell away from his chest. But his presence remained, a wall, a warning, a line that could not be crossed. "I'm going," Patrick muttered, his voice breaking. "I'm going, but this isn't... You can't just..." He didn't finish the sentence. He turned, stumbled toward the automatic doors, and crashed through them into the rain-soaked night. The doors hissed shut behind him, and through the glass, Helen watched him run across the parking lot, not to his motorcycle, but on foot, splashing through puddles, his silhouette growing smaller and smaller, until the darkness swallowed him whole. The rain consumed his retreat like it had never happened. Helen stood frozen, her entire body trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the sudden release of weeks of accumulated terror. Her knees felt weak. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She pressed a hand against the counter to steady herself and realized her cheeks were wet. She was crying, silent tears streaming down her face while her body processed what had just happened. He was gone. Patrick was gone. Jack turned slowly, his dark eyes finding hers across the empty cafeteria. His expression was still calm, still unreadable, but something in it had softened, just slightly. He pulled his hood back, revealing his full face for the first time. The scar through his eyebrow. The exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. The weight of whatever ghosts he carried. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Helen let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I don't know. I think so. Her voice broke. "Thank you, God, thank you. I didn't think anyone would, no one else would. It's okay." Jack's voice was gentle now. The steel gone. "You're safe." Those two words, "you're safe," broke something loose inside Helen. She covered her face with her hands and wept, all the fear and exhaustion and fury of the past weeks pouring out in great, shuddering sobs. Jack didn't move toward her, didn't try to comfort her physically. He just stood there, a quiet presence, giving her space to fall apart without judgment. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cafeteria, for the first time in weeks, Helen Riggs could breathe. Helen hadn't slept. She'd gone home just before dawn, taken a scalding hot shower that turned her skin pink, and then sat on her bed staring at the wall until her alarm went off. Every sound had made her flinch. The creak of the building settling, a car door slamming in the distance, the wind rattling her window. But the sound she'd been dreading most, the rumble of Patrick's motorcycle engine, never came. For the first time in weeks, the night had been silent. Now, walking through the hospital corridors toward the staff locker room for her evening shift, Helen felt like she was moving through water. Exhaustion weighted her limbs, but underneath it was something else. A fragile, tentative thing she was afraid to name. Hope, maybe. Or just the absence of constant terror. The locker room was empty when she arrived, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead. Helen moved toward her locker on autopilot, fishing her keys from her purse. It wasn't until she was 2 steps away that she noticed it. A piece of paper, folded once, tucked carefully under her locker door, so that just the edge was visible. Her heart stopped. No, not again, please. Not again. Her hands trembled as she bent down and pulled it free, memories flooding back. All those notes Patrick had left on her windshield, under her apartment door, appearing like a curse she couldn't break. She almost didn't want to open it, almost wanted to throw it away without looking, to pretend she'd never seen it. But she had to know. Helen's fingers fumbled with the paper, unfolding it with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The handwriting that greeted her wasn't Patrick's neat, almost childish script. This was different. Rough, angular, deliberate. The letters looked like they'd been carved rather than written, each one pressed deep into the paper. If he comes back, tell security the man in red will visit again. That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those 12 words in heavy black ink. Helen read it 3 times, her breath coming faster each time. Then her knees gave out, and she sat down hard on the bench in front of the lockers, the note clutched in both hands. Jack, the man in the red hoodie, had left her a message, a promise, a shield made of words. Something inside Helen's chest cracked open, not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd kept locked for too long. Tears blurred her vision, but she was smiling. Actually smiling. When was the last time she'd done that? She pressed the note against her chest, right over her pounding heart, and let herself cry. Not from fear this time. From relief. From gratitude. From the overwhelming feeling of not being alone anymore. After a few minutes, she carefully folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, right next to her grandmother's old prayer card that she carried everywhere. 2 kinds of protection, 2 kinds of faith. Helen stood, wiped her eyes, and opened her locker to change into her scrubs. As she pulled on her white uniform, she caught her reflection in the small mirror taped to the inside of the locker door. She looked tired, worn, but her eyes looked different, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. Word spread fast. By the end of Helen's first shift, everyone was talking about it. "Did you hear?" Shanice whispered during their break, leaning close over her sandwich. "Patrick Lang, that creep who was bothering you, he's gone." Helen's head snapped up. Gone? Left town, apparently. Just packed up his apartment in the middle of the night and disappeared. His landlord found the place empty this morning, rent paid through the month, but everything cleared out, like he ran. Shanice's eyes were wide, hungry for gossip. "Girl, what happened? Did you finally get that restraining order?" Helen shook her head slowly. "No, I didn't do anything." "Well, something happened. Marcus in security said Patrick came flying through the parking lot last night around 1 in the morning, on foot, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Got in his car and just left. Didn't even go back for his motorcycle." Shanice paused, studying Helen's face. "You know something. I can tell." "I don't know anything," Helen said quietly. It wasn't exactly a lie. She knew what had happened in the cafeteria, but she didn't know where Patrick had gone or why he'd run. She only knew that when Jack Gibson had stood between them, something in Patrick had broken, and apparently stayed broken. Shanice didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. "Well, whatever the reason, good riddance. That man was trouble. You deserve to feel safe at work." Safe. There was that word again. Over the next few days, The whispers intensified. Patrick's disappearance became hospital legend, the story growing with each retelling. "I heard he got threatened by someone," one nurse said in the break room. "Not just someone," another replied. "That big guy, the one in the red hoodie who's always in the cafeteria at night. You know, the ex-firefighter? I heard he used to fight in underground clubs, bare-knuckle stuff. I heard he's part of some biker gang. I heard Patrick tried to start something and got his ass handed to him." Helen listened to the rumors from a distance, never correcting them, never adding her own version. Let them talk. Let the legend grow. The truth was simpler and stranger than any story they could invent. A silent man in a red hoodie had stood between her and darkness, and that had been enough. Sometimes the quietest acts of protection were the loudest. That night, Helen worked a late shift again. As midnight approached, she found herself drifting toward the cafeteria during her break, her heart beating faster with each step. She didn't know if he'd be there, didn't know if last night had been a one-time thing, if Jack had simply been in the right place at the right time and would now fade back into whatever solitary existence he'd carved out for himself. But when she pushed through the cafeteria doors, there he was, same spot at the counter, same red hoodie, same cup of black coffee, and that profound, almost meditative stillness, as if nothing had changed, as if he'd been there every night for 1,000 years and would be there for 1,000 more. Jack looked up when she entered, his dark eyes meeting hers across the empty room. Helen froze, suddenly unsure. Should she thank him again? Should she try to explain what his protection meant to her? Should she? Jack nodded once, just once, a simple acknowledgement that needed no words. Helen nodded back, feeling tears prick her eyes again. Then she got her coffee and sat down, not next to him, but within line of sight. Close enough to feel protected. Far enough to respect the boundaries of whatever unspoken agreement they'd formed. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The note in her pocket and the man at the counter said everything that mattered. Every night after that, Helen listened. As she worked her shifts, as she walked to her car, as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she listened for the sound that had terrorized her for weeks. The rumble of Patrick's motorcycle engine, the knock on her door, the evidence that her nightmare wasn't over. But it never came. Patrick Lang had vanished like smoke, and with him went the constant weight of fear that had been crushing Helen's chest. She started sleeping through the night, started walking to her car without keys clenched between her fingers, started existing in the world without constantly looking over her shoulder. And late at night, when she did her rounds past the cafeteria and saw Jack sitting in his usual spot, silent, watchful, wrapped in that red hoodie-like armor, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. Not because the world had become less dangerous, not because men like Patrick had stopped existing, but because someone had stood between her and the darkness and refused to move. Because a stranger with his own demons had chosen to protect her when no one else would. The man in red was watching, and somehow that made all the difference. 3 weeks passed like a slow exhale. Helen fell back into her routines, night shifts in the trauma ward, coffee breaks in the cafeteria, the familiar rhythm of saving lives and bearing witness to suffering. But something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had colored every moment, that had turned ordinary activities into acts of courage, had finally loosened its grip. Patrick Lang remained gone, vanished, like he'd never existed at all. Helen still saw Jack most nights, sitting at his usual spot in the cafeteria. They'd exchange brief nods, nothing more. He never approached her, never tried to capitalize on what he'd done, never seemed to want anything from her except the quiet understanding that had passed between them that rainy night. But Helen was curious. She couldn't help it. Who was this man who'd stepped into her nightmare without hesitation? What ghosts drove him to sit alone in hospital cafeterias at midnight, wrapped in silence like a second skin? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen, a paramedic who'd been working at Mercy General for nearly a decade, cornered Helen in the supply room one afternoon. Marcus was the kind of person who knew everyone's business, not out of malice, but because he genuinely cared about the people who passed through these halls. "I heard what happened," he said without preamble, his voice low. "With that guy who was stalking you. And I heard Jack Gibson had something to do with him disappearing." Helen stiffened, her hands pausing over the inventory sheet she'd been checking. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus held up his hands. "Hey, I'm not looking for gossip. I'm glad someone finally stepped up. Security should have handled it weeks ago." He paused, studying her face. "But I wanted you to know something about Jack, in case you were wondering who he is." Helen's curiosity won out over her caution. "Okay." Marcus leaned against the supply shelves, his expression growing somber. "Jack Gibson used to be a firefighter. Not just any firefighter, he was a captain. One of the best. Led Engine Company 47 in South Memphis for almost 8 years. His crew loved him, trusted him completely." "What happened?" Helen asked quietly, though part of her already knew the answer would hurt. 5 years ago, there was a warehouse fire. Old building, suspected arson, fully involved when they got the call. But there were reports of squatters inside, homeless people who used the place for shelter. Jack's crew went in." Marcus's jaw tightened. The building had been gutted for renovations. Someone had removed support beams, compromised the structure. Nobody knew. Jack led his team to the second floor, and the whole thing came down. Helen felt her chest constrict. "Oh my God!" Jack was the only one who made it out. 5 firefighters died that day, all under his command. All following him into that building because they trusted him. Marcus's eyes were distant, remembering. "I was on the ambulance crew that responded. I saw them pull Jack from the rubble, covered in burns, broken ribs, collapsed lung. But the worst injuries weren't the ones you could see." "He blamed himself," Helen whispered. "Still does. He quit the force as soon as he could walk. Disappeared for a couple of years. When he showed up again, he was different, quieter, harder. People say he fights in underground matches now, but I don't know if that's true or just rumors." Marcus looked at Helen directly. "What I do know is that he volunteers at the burn unit upstairs. Has for about 6 months now. Works with patients who are recovering from fire injuries. Helps them with physical therapy. Teaches them exercises to regain mobility. The staff says he's incredibly gentle, incredibly patient. Like he's trying to save people he couldn't save before." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. The pieces were coming together. The silence, the stillness, the way Jack had moved to protect her without hesitation. He was a man carrying the weight of 5 deaths, searching for redemption in a world that probably couldn't offer it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Marcus smiled sadly. "Because I saw the way you look at him in the cafeteria, like you're trying to figure him out. And I thought you should know. Jack Gibson is one of the good ones. Broken, maybe. Haunted, Definitely. But good. Right down to his bones. 2 days later, Helen found herself on the 4th floor, the burn unit. She'd worked there occasionally during her first year at Mercy General, before transferring to trauma. It was one of the hardest rotations, watching people struggle with unimaginable pain, with disfigurement, with the long, agonizing process of healing from fire. She told herself she was just checking on a former patient, but that was a lie. She was looking for Jack. She found him in the physical therapy room, a bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in afternoon sunlight. He was kneeling beside a young man, early 20s maybe, with angry red scars covering his arms and neck. The patient was trying to stretch his right arm above his head, his face contorted with pain and frustration. "Can't," the young man gasped. "It won't go any higher." "It will," Jack said quietly, his voice gentle in a way Helen had never heard. "Not today, maybe, but it will. You just have to keep showing up. Keep trying. The body remembers how to heal if you give it time." His scarred hands, those same hands that had held Patrick at bay with such unwavering strength, now guided the young man's arm with infinite patience, supporting the weight, adjusting the angle, demonstrating the movement with his own body first. "Like this," Jack said, raising his own arm slowly, deliberately. "Feel the resistance. Don't fight it. Just acknowledge it and breathe through it." The young man tried again, his arm trembling with effort. This time it went a few inches higher, his face lit up with surprised triumph. "There," Jack said, something that might have been approval warming his voice. "That's progress." "I did it!" The young man was grinning now, energized. "Did you see that?" I saw." Jack's expression remained neutral, but Helen could see something softer in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or hope. Helen stood in the doorway, watching this scene unfold, and felt her heart crack open. This was who Jack Gibson really was. Not the mysterious figure in the red hoodie, not the silent fighter from underground clubs, but a man trying to help others heal because he couldn't heal himself. A man who'd lost his crew but kept fighting to save people. One patient at a time. One gentle adjustment at a time. Jack must have sensed her presence because his head turned slightly, his eyes finding hers across the room. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Helen felt the weight of everything unspoken between them. Gratitude, recognition, shared understanding of what it meant to carry trauma and keep moving forward anyway. She lifted her hand to her chest, then extended it toward him, the ASL sign she'd learned from a deaf patient years ago. "Thank you." But she also mouthed the words, making sure he understood. "Thank you." Jack held her gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then he nodded once, just once, the same simple acknowledgement he always gave. No smile, no words, just that quiet confirmation that he'd heard her, that he understood, that whatever unspoken bond they'd formed that rainy night still held. Helen nodded back, her throat tight with emotion. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Jack to his work. That evening, Helen stopped by the nurse's station on the 4th floor. The charge nurse, an older woman named Dorothy, who'd worked at Mercy General for 30 years, was reviewing charts. "Dorothy, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." "The volunteer who works with the burn patients. Jack Gibson. How long has he been coming?" Dorothy looked up, her expression softening. "About 6 months now. Comes 3 times a week, always in the afternoon. Works with the patients who are struggling most, the ones who've lost hope, who can't imagine their bodies will ever work right again." She paused. He's good with them, patient, never pushes too hard. It's like he understands exactly what they're going through. He does, Helen said quietly. He was burned in a fire, lost his whole crew. I know. Dorothy's eyes were kind. That man carries more grief than anyone should have to bear. But he turns it into something beautiful, uses his pain to help others. That's rare, Helen. That's real strength. Helen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about Jack's scarred hands guiding that young man's arm, about the quiet determination in his voice, about the way he showed up day after day, sitting in that cafeteria at midnight or working with burn patients in the afternoon, never asking for recognition or gratitude, just standing between people and their darkness, helping them find their way back to the light. The silent protector. That's what he was. And Helen understood now that he didn't protect others in spite of his brokenness. He protected them because of it. The detective showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, just as Helen was finishing her shift. She was in the staff locker room, changing out of her scrubs, when one of the security guards poked his head in. "Helen, there's a detective here asking to speak with you. Says it's about Patrick Lang." Helen's stomach dropped. For a moment, she was back in that cafeteria, watching Patrick stumble through the rain, feeling the weight of weeks of terror finally lifting. Had something happened? Had he come back? "Where?" she asked, pulling on her jacket with trembling hands. "Conference Room B." The detective was a middle-aged black woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Monroe, Homicide Division, and gestured for Helen to sit. "Homicide?" Helen's voice came out higher than she intended. "Is Patrick? Did something happen to him?" No. Detective Monroe held up a hand. "Nothing like that. I'm following up on a missing persons report filed by his landlord. Patrick Lang cleared out his apartment 3 weeks ago, paid rent through the month, but left no forwarding address. His family hasn't heard from him. We're just checking all the connections." Helen felt her shoulders relax slightly. "I filed multiple complaints about him with hospital security. He was stalking me." "I know. I read the reports." Detective Monroe's expression softened with something like sympathy. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry security didn't take it more seriously." She pulled out a small notebook. "Can you tell me the last time you saw Patrick?" Helen chose her words carefully. 3 weeks ago, late at night in the hospital cafeteria. He came in, tried to talk to me. Someone intervened. Patrick left, and I haven't seen him since." "Someone intervened?" Detective Monroe's pen hovered over her notebook. "Who?" "Another person who was in the cafeteria. A man." Helen paused. "He told Patrick to leave. Patrick left." "Did this man threaten Patrick? Assault him?" "No." Helen met the detective's eyes steadily. "He just stood between us, told Patrick to leave. Patrick chose to leave." Detective Monroe studied her for a long moment, then wrote something in her notebook. "This man, does he have a name?" Helen hesitated. She could give Jack's name, pull him into this investigation, expose him to questions and scrutiny he didn't deserve. Or she could protect him the way he'd protected her. "I don't know his name," she said quietly. "He's just someone I've seen around the hospital at night." It wasn't technically a lie. She'd never asked his name. Marcus had told her, but she hadn't learned it from Jack himself. Detective Monroe's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe Helen, but she let it go. "Well, here's what we know. 3 weeks ago, around 2 a.m., Patrick Lang boarded a Greyhound bus heading to Phoenix, Arizona. paid cash for a one-way ticket. The ticket agent remembered him because he seemed, she checked her notes, extremely agitated and kept looking over his shoulder. Phoenix? Helen frowned. Does he have family there? Not that we can find. Near as we can tell, he just picked a direction and ran. Detective Monroe flipped a page. We managed to track down the bus driver, woman named Rita Gomez, been driving that route for 15 years. She remembered Patrick, too. Said he sat in the back, didn't sleep, kept muttering to himself. Helen's heart was beating faster now. Muttering what? Detective Monroe's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. A recognition of the strangeness of what she was about to say. According to the driver, he kept saying something about a ghost in a red hood. She thought he might be on drugs or having some kind of breakdown. Said he looked terrified. A ghost in a red hood. Helen felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Jack's red hoodie, pulled up over his head, shadowing his face. The way he'd appeared like a phantom between her and Patrick, silent and immovable. The way Patrick had looked at him and seen something that broke his obsession completely. Ms. Riggs? Detective Monroe's voice pulled her back. Do you know what he might have meant by that? Helen shook her head slowly. No idea. Another long look from the detective, but she closed her notebook. Well, unless something changes, we're classifying this as a voluntary departure. No evidence of foul play, no indication Patrick was in danger. He just left. She stood, handing Helen a business card. If he contacts you, or if you think of anything else, call me. I will, Helen said, taking the card. Detective Monroe paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad he's gone. I've seen too many cases like yours end badly. Whatever made him run, she met Helen's eyes meaningfully. I'm grateful for it. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, Detective Monroe's words echoing in her head. A ghost in a red hood. Patrick had been so terrified of Jack that he'd fled the state. Boarded a bus in the middle of the night. Run from something he couldn't name or explain. What had he seen in Jack's eyes that night? Helen closed her eyes, and suddenly she was dreaming. Vivid, visceral images that felt more like memories than imagination. Fire, walls of orange and red, smoke thick as oil, heat that seared the lungs with every breath. Voices shouting through the roar. Captain, we need to pull back. There's someone on the second floor. Gibson, the structure's compromised. A choice made in seconds. We're going in. Stay close. Stairs groaning under their weight. Flames licking at their gear. The ceiling beginning to sag. Warning signs they should have heeded, but didn't, because there might be someone alive up there. Someone they could still save. Then the world exploded. Beams crashing down. Floors collapsing. Bodies falling. Screams cut short. The weight of rubble. Crushing. 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 And through it all, the terrible knowledge. I led them here. I made the call. This is my fault. Waking in a hospital bed, burned and broken. Asking about his crew and seeing the answer in the doctor's eyes before the words came. I'm sorry, Captain Gibson. You were the only survivor. 5 names. 5 families. 5 deaths that couldn't be undone. The decision to never speak unless necessary. Because what were words worth when the only ones that mattered, pull back, it's not safe, had come too late? The silence became a penance. The late nights in the hospital cafeteria became a vigil. The work with burn patients became atonement. And the promise? Spoken to no one but himself, sworn in the darkness of sleepless nights. Never again. Never again would someone die because he failed to stand between them and the fire. Helen woke with tears streaming down her face, her heart pounding, the taste of smoke and grief thick in her throat. Even though the dream hadn't been hers, it had been Jack's. Somehow, impossibly, she'd felt what he felt. She understood now. Jack's silence wasn't anger at the world or at himself. It was atonement, a monk's vow, a soldier's oath. He'd lost 5 people once because he'd made the wrong call, because he'd led them into danger he should have seen coming. And he'd decided that the rest of his life would be about standing between people and their darkness, about being the wall between victims and violence, about never, never losing anyone again. That's what Patrick had seen in Jack's eyes that night. Not just a man willing to fight, but a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and had rebuilt himself into a shield. A ghost in a red hood who'd died once in that warehouse fire and emerged as something else entirely. A silent guardian who appeared in hospital cafeterias at midnight, who helped burn victims learn to move again, who stood between terrified nurses and their stalkers without asking for anything in return. Jack Gibson had sworn never to lose anyone again. And when Helen had whispered, "He keeps following me," she'd become part of that vow. Someone worth protecting, someone worth standing for. Patrick had run from a ghost, but Helen had been saved by one. The next morning, Helen sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Detective Monroe's card. She turned it over in her fingers, thinking about what the detective had said. Whatever made him run, I'm grateful for it. Helen was grateful too, not just for Patrick's absence, but for what his disappearance had revealed. That there were still people in this world who stood up when others wouldn't, who carried their own broken pieces and used them to protect others, who made silence into strength and grief into purpose. She thought about Jack sitting in that cafeteria night after night, wrapped in his red hoodie like armor, waiting, watching, ready, a ghost in a red hood, a silent protector, an angel who'd forgotten he had wings. Helen understood now, and understanding felt like grace. 4 months later, spring arrived at Mercy General with reluctant warmth, coaxing early flowers from the courtyard gardens and painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Helen had switched to day shifts, a decision that felt like reclaiming her life, like stepping back into sunlight after months of living in shadows. She slept through the nights now, walked to her car without fear, existed in the world without constantly looking over her shoulder. Patrick Lang had become a memory, distant and fading, like a nightmare that loses its power once you've woken up. But Jack Gibson, he remained vivid, present, a constant reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. She still saw him occasionally, though their paths crossed less often now that she worked days. Sometimes she'd glimpse him in the burn unit during her afternoon rounds, his red hoodie a beacon of quiet constancy. Sometimes she'd pass him in the parking lot at shift change, their eyes meeting briefly in mutual acknowledgement before they went their separate ways. They never spoke, but the silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than questions. This particular morning, Helen had come in early. Her shift didn't start until 7, but she'd woken before dawn with restless energy and decided to walk the hospital grounds, to watch the sunrise paint the world in gold. The courtyard was her favorite place, a small garden tucked between the main building and the outpatient wing. with benches arranged around a fountain that had been donated by a grateful family decades ago. She was standing by the fountain, coffee in hand, watching the sky shift from deep purple to pink when she heard it. Laughter. A child's laughter, high and bright and full of genuine joy. Helen turned toward the sound and saw them at the far end of the courtyard, near the physical therapy pavilion. Jack, kneeling on the stone pathway, his red hoodie vivid against the soft morning light. And in front of him, a boy, maybe 10 years old, with bandages covering his arms and the left side of his neck, wearing the loose athletic clothes patients used for PT sessions. The boy was trying to walk. Helen's medical training kicked in immediately. She could see the stiffness in his gait, the way he favored his right leg, the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose body had been through trauma and was still learning to trust itself again. Burns, clearly, severe enough to require extensive grafting and months of rehabilitation. But he was walking, taking small, shuffling steps with Jack's hands hovering near his shoulders, not touching, not supporting, just present, ready to catch him if he fell. "I'm doing it!" the boy exclaimed, his voice cracking with excitement. "Look, Jack, I'm actually doing it." "You are," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtyard in the morning stillness. "5 more steps. You can do 5 more." The boy's face scrunched with concentration. He took 1 step, then another, his legs trembling with effort. On the 3rd step, he wobbled, and Jack's hands moved fractionally closer, but the boy caught himself, regained his balance, and pushed forward. 4 steps. 5. When he reached the bench that had been his goal, the boy collapsed onto it with a whoop of triumph, laughing so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "Did you see that? Did you see? Wait until I tell Mom. She's not going to believe it." Jack lowered himself onto the bench beside the boy, his expression still neutral, but Helen could see something in his eyes, something soft and warm and almost hopeful. "She'll believe it. You've been working hard. This is what hard work looks like. I couldn't have done it without you." The boy turned to Jack, his young face suddenly serious. "The other therapists, they're nice and everything, but they don't get it. Not like you do. You know what it's like." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I do." "Were you scared?" the boy asked. "After the fire? When you were healing?" "Every day," Jack said simply. "Still am, sometimes." "But you kept going." "I kept going." Jack's scarred hand rested on the boy's shoulder. A brief touch, there and gone. "Same way you're going to keep going, because that's what survivors do." The boy nodded solemnly, like he was accepting a sacred trust. Then his smile returned. "Race you back to the entrance? You just walked 10 steps, and you want to race?" But there was something almost like amusement in Jack's voice. "Okay, fine. Walk race, slowest one wins." Jack stood, extending his hand to help the boy up. "Come on, then. Your mom's probably waiting." Helen watched them make their slow progress back toward the building, the boy chattering excitedly, Jack responding with occasional quiet words. Her throat felt tight, her eyes burning with unshed tears. This was who Jack Gibson really was. Not the ghost in the red hood who'd terrified Patrick into fleeing the state, but a man who knelt on stone pathways at sunrise to help children remember how to walk. A man who turned his own shattered pieces into something that could heal others. She found herself moving toward them without conscious decision, her feet carrying her across the courtyard. Jack noticed her approach. He always noticed everything, and said something to the boy, who waved at Helen cheerfully before heading inside through the automatic doors. Then it was just the two of them, standing in the morning light, the fountain murmuring behind them. "Hi," Helen said, suddenly unsure. They'd shared so much without words. How did you translate silence into speech? "I?" Jack replied. His hood was down, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his scarred face fully visible in the golden light. Helen took a breath, searching for the right words. "You saved me," she said softly. "That night, when I thought no one would help, when I was so scared I couldn't think. You saved me." Jack shook his head slowly, something like discomfort crossing his features. "No." "Yes," Helen insisted. You saved yourself." His voice was firm but gentle. "You chose to ask for help. You chose to trust a stranger. You chose to keep showing up for work, to keep living your life despite being terrified. All I did was stand in the way." Helen felt tears spill over. Standing in the way was everything. Jack held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the weight he carried. 5 deaths, years of guilt, a debt he believed could never be repaid. But she also saw something else, a flicker of peace, fragile and new. Like maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to believe that standing between people and their darkness might be enough. That protection could be its own form of salvation. "I'm glad you're safe," he said quietly. "Because of you. Because you're strong." Jack pulled his red hoodie up over his head, the familiar gesture that meant their conversation was ending. "Stronger than you know." He turned toward the parking lot, his footsteps quiet on the stone pathway. The rising sun caught his red hoodie, and for a moment, just one brilliant moment, the fabric seemed to glow. The deep crimson transformed into gold, like something sacred, like a knight's banner or an angel's wings. Helen stood watching him go, this silent guardian who'd appeared in her darkest hour and refused to let her fall. This man who carried ghosts but chose to protect the living. This stranger who'd become her shield without asking for anything in return. "Sometimes angels wear red," she whispered to the morning air. Jack paused at the edge of the courtyard, his back to her. She couldn't see his face, couldn't tell if he'd heard, but his shoulders rose and fell with what might have been a deep breath, and then he lifted one hand, just slightly, just enough, in acknowledgement or farewell or blessing. Then he walked on, disappearing around the corner of the building, swallowed by the ordinary bustle of a hospital morning. Cars arriving, staff rushing to shifts, patients being wheeled to appointments. Life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. But Helen stood still, her coffee growing cold in her hands, her eyes on the empty space where Jack had been. She thought about the boy learning to walk again, about burn victims finding strength in scarred hands, about a nurse who'd whispered her fear to a stranger and found salvation. She thought about the quiet ways people saved each other, about how redemption didn't always roar, about how the strongest protection often came wrapped in silence. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the rumble of a motorcycle engine starting up. Jack, heading wherever he went between his vigils. But Helen knew he'd be back, tonight or tomorrow, or whenever someone needed a wall between themselves and the darkness, because that's what Jack Gibson did. He showed up. He stood in the way. He turned his grief into a shield for others. A ghost in a red hood. A silent protector. An angel who'd forgotten his wings but learned to guard others with his broken pieces instead. Helen lifted her coffee cup to the sky, a small toast to absent guardians and quiet redemption. Then she turned and walked toward the hospital entrance, toward her shift, toward the life Patrick Lang had tried to steal from her but couldn't, because she'd been saved. Not by violence or vengeance, but by a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand between someone and their fear, and refuse to move. The morning sun continued its climb, painting the world in shades of hope. And somewhere in that golden light, a man in a red hoodie kept his silent vigil, watching over people who would never know his name but would always remember how safe they felt in his presence. Sometimes, the people we fear are the ones sent to stand between us and the darkness. And sometimes, the loudest acts of protection are done in silence.